After nearly a century of misguided weight training dogma, Doug Brignole reveals surprising new insights in the science of resistance exercise. These insights lead us to identify the 20 most efficient and safe exercises for optimal muscle development. Based on Brignole's 40 years of experience as an accomplished competitive bodybuilder and his extensive biomechanics knowledge, Doug Brignole and Smart Training 365 present the Brig 20. The 20 best anatomical movements for joint safety and optimum physique development. Revolutionary insights that are changing the global fitness industry.
Hi, and welcome to Smart Training 365. This is Mo Larbi, and I'm with Doug Brignole. How you doing, Doug?
Fine, Mo. How are you?
Doing great. So today is part 3. Last time we talked about the preacher curl. That's where we left off. So if you didn't watch part 1 and part 2, we recommend you scroll down. You will find them. This is the response video. So if you saw like a clip of Doug like talking a certain way, it's not us who initiated that. It's actually a response video. Now it became like obviously more emotional, and he focused more on the emotional part of it and forgot about the actual facts, the science, and the proof. Anyway, so Doug, you said you wanted to come back to the preacher curl.
I want to revisit that a little bit too, because I brought some slides that help explain a little bit better what we were talking about.
All right, we can start.
Okay, so you know, his comment was that there's nothing wrong with stretching the bicep during a preacher curl. And so when we last left off, I said the preacher curl does not stretch the bicep. And I've never said that what is wrong with the preacher curl is that it stretches the bicep. In fact, the bicep doesn't actually stretch until you put your arm behind your back. So it's not a matter of stretching the bicep. It's a matter of mechanical disadvantage. So I brought some slides that I'll show you that are from the book in the chapter where we talk about mechanical advantage and disadvantage. But so the first slide we're seeing here is basically it's a lever device that I typically use when I do my seminars. And if it looks kind of funny, it's because it started off as a seated calf raise machine. It's an actual device, and I chopped off the seat, and I chopped off the part that holds your knees, that's under your knees, or on top of your knees actually. And then I welded these little loops on the top of that bar to show how the lever length and the lever direction of pull is altered. So what I say to the audience is, imagine that this lever arm is your forearm. And this thing on the left over here, which is where the weight is your hand. I'm going to put a 10-pound weight in your hand, and I slide that plate on there. And then this pivot on the other side, that's your elbow. Okay, so imagine this is your forearm held parallel to the ground, horizontally. That's your elbow. That's the weight in the hand. Now imagine that your bicep is pulling on that forearm. How much is your bicep holding when you're holding a 10-pound weight? And of course, it's kind of a trick question. So I take the scale that I use with a hook and I put it on that very first hook. And it shows close to 10 pounds because I'm basically pulling from where the wrist would be, right? But that's not where the bicep pulls from.
Right.
The bicep pulls way on the other end of the forearm bones near the elbow. So then I keep moving the little scale down to each hook. And each time I move it up, it goes 27, 34, 55, 66, blah, blah. The next slide you'll see there is by the time you get to the very last hook, it measures 112 pounds. So that's how much your bicep is actually pulling. The force that it's loaded with is about 112 pounds when you're holding a 10-pound weight in your hand and your forearm is horizontal. And what I emphasize when I do the seminar is I say, now notice that I am pulling perpendicular to the forearm. The forearm is horizontal, I'm pulling vertically or pretty close to vertically, right? That's called mechanical advantage. And it's called that because what it means is that all of my effort is being used to pull that lever in the same direction that I want that lever to go, that lever can go, which is up. Watch what happens when I pull from an angle. So on this next slide, you'll see that I am pulling from a 45-degree angle, halfway between vertical and horizontal. And now the amount of force that scale shows is 220 pounds. It's essentially doubled, even though that's still just a 10-pound weight in your hand. Now, this is measurable. This is provable. This is not theoretical. This is, anybody can do this test, and you will see that when you pour from a non-perpendicular angle on a lever, you have to use more force. And the reason for this is because we still need 112 pounds to go up. But now, since I'm pulling halfway in and halfway up, only half of my effort is being used in an upward direction, and the other half is being used in an inward direction. So imagine that the change of angle that your bicep would pull on your forearm would double, even though the weight in your hand has not doubled, just because you're now pulling from more of a mechanical disadvantage. It's not the most extreme mechanical disadvantage yet, but you can see that already it's doubled.
Okay.
So on this next slide, you'll see I'm pulling from what would be a 20-degree angle, almost parallel to that forearm. And this would be about 9 times more load that I would have to produce in order to make that 10-pound weight up. Okay, so now look at this next slide, and you can see what we're talking about. When your bicep is pulling on your forearm from that mostly parallel angle as it is there on the left, and I've circled the attachment of the bicep tendon on the forearm, you can see that it's pulling mostly parallel to that bone. And on the right, I'm not quite pulling it not with a 90-degree bend in my elbow yet, but you can see the mechanical advantage that that bicep tendon is gaining. So when you do a standing curl, you start off with a mechanical disadvantage,
Right.
which means that any amount of force that you have on there, even the smallest amount of force, is being magnified 9 to 10 times as much as it would be if you were pulling perpendicular to the forearm. That's why we recommend that you start your curls with a mostly vertical forearm, meaning upright curls, dumbbells, cables, that sort of thing. And this is what's wrong with the preacher curl. So on this next slide, you see me sitting in a preacher curl bench. I've got an easy curl bar there in my hands, no weight on it, just to show you how straight my elbow is. And you can imagine my bicep tendon pulling on my forearm bone. Now that you've actually seen the anatomical illustration, you can see now the amount of mechanical disadvantage, a degree of disadvantage that my bicep would have. And you can also see that that forearm is not vertical. You can see the weight is not directly under my elbow. So that means that I'm going to have, I'm not going to have as much load on my forearm as I would if that forearm was horizontal, but it's already more than it would be if it was vertical.
Okay.
Times the 9-fold magnification. So now we're talking a tremendously increased magnification. Now, this next slide, I have my arm on a tabletop. And you can see that if I were to lower my forearm all the way down, my forearm and my upper arm would be completely horizontal, completely perpendicular to gravity. And in the previous episode, we talked about moment arm.
Yes.
The distance between the elbow and the weight. So you can see that the distance between the elbow and the weight here will be much greater than it would be on a preacher curl. And that would be greater than it would be if it was vertical. So we're talking about the magnification of force. And so when you're doing a preacher curl, you have 2 magnifications. The magnification of the fact that the forearm is not vertical and the magnification of the mechanical disadvantage. The problem is that the magnification of the mechanical disadvantage is 9 to 10 times greater, which is significantly greater than the degree of angle of that forearm in the starting position. So what might normally seem like a small increase of magnification is really a significant increase in magnification. So now here I'm going to show you 6 slides taken from a video where you can see a guy doing a 1-arm preacher dumbbell curl. So you can see on slide 1 and 2 there, he's just doing his thing. He's just going through the motions. All of a sudden on 3 and 4, you can see he's at the bottom, mechanical disadvantage on number 3. Number 4, look at the way that bicep has now slid up his arm. He just snapped his tendon. Where? When the elbow was nearly straight. Why?
Right.
Because of mechanical disadvantage combined with the fact that his forearm was not vertical when he started. Slide 5 and 6 is him, of course, jumping off the bench, cringing in pain. And now he has to deal with probably the surgical reattachment of that bicep tendon. And who knows how many months of healing, and who knows if he'll ever be quite the way he was before.
Right.
Okay, so it is ridiculous to think that a preacher barbell curl is, when I'm talking, by the way, a preacher barbell curl with free weight. I'm not talking about a machine preacher curl or a cable preacher curl, because these offer different directions of resistance.
Yes.
When you're talking about free weight, you're talking about straight down. So the angle of the forearm relative to that straight down is what you'd be looking at. It is ridiculous to think that they're equally safe. Now, it might be equally safe if you're talking about a very light weight. But once you get into a significant weight, and by the way, when you're training, you're always pushing the limits. That's the nature of training. You're pushing the limits, right? You're going to be tempted to go heavier and heavier. You're not going to get any notice, any warning. This guy wasn't getting any warning whatsoever. Hey, listen, on that next rep, your bicep tendon is going to tear. You don't know. It just happens, right? What we do is we tell you where the risk is. We tell you where to be cautious. And not only cautious in the sense of being, let's say, overly cautious, but in the sense of what's the trade-off? Yeah. There's a high risk here to doing this preacher curl, barbell dumbbell curl. And are you thinking that it's helping above and beyond what you'd be getting with a standard vertical upright curl? Now, here's what you need to understand. Whenever you add resistance to one end of the range of motion, you take it away from the other end. So what you will discover, if you haven't already discovered it, is it's heavy, very heavy at the bottom. And you probably instinctively know not to straighten your elbow. So you already stop short of fully straightened elbow, which means you're already losing some range of motion. Yeah. And then halfway through the range of motion, you realize it's actually easier than you'd like it to be. It's challenging you less than you'd like it to, but you can't use a heavier weight, because if you use a heavier weight, it gets even harder at the bottom. And then when you get to the top of the range of motion, you get 0. Yeah. Whereas if you were to do an upright vertical curl, you have magnification from the mechanical disadvantage in the beginning. So you don't need more than that. You're already getting enough early phase loading. Then as the bicep enters more of a mechanically advantageous angle with the forearm, the resistance increases conveniently. In other words, it's heavier where you're stronger, right? And then as the mechanical disadvantage diminishes, because now the bicep tendon is pulling like this relative to your forearm, right? The resistance is also diminishing. That's why we say, if you're going to choose one exercise, the best one would be something that gives you more of a straight down direction of resistance. Now, in this next slide here, this is taken from my book. You can see me there in the book. It's black and white, but here it's in color. I'm wearing a purple shirt. You can see what I've done is I'm sitting in a slight incline bench, and I've positioned a board behind my elbows. That means my elbows can't go back. They are in line with my torso. And in figure A there, you can see that my forearm is not quite vertical. It's at about a 10-degree angle. Okay, so now compare that 10-degree angle to the 45-degree angle of a preacher curl. And you can see the difference between the magnification you get from that forearm being perpendicular to gravity. Now, if you wanted to incline this bench farther back and create a slightly higher or steeper angle to that, somewhere between this and a preacher curl, you could experiment with that. But keep in mind that the heavier you go, the more problematic and risky it becomes. So when you're doing this exercise right here with a 10-degree angle, not a 45-degree angle, you will discover that you can actually let your elbow go straight when the weight is around 20 pounds. Once you start getting to 25 and 30, excuse me, and everybody is different, of course, you will notice that it gets more and more precarious in that bottom part of the range of motion. It gets more and more dangerous feeling. Now, notice that I'm using a hammer grip in this particular version, and a hammer grip automatically makes it safer. So if you're going to do a preacher curl or any degree of angle, you're better off doing it without the palm being up, because with a hammer grip, you have the assistance, the protection of the brachioradialis helping. But if you're palm up and your elbow is straight and you're overloaded at the bottom, there's a very high risk of bicep rupture. Now, the evidence of this is extensive. Look how many deadlifters tear their bicep, even though their forearm is mostly vertical. Again, it only takes 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 5 degrees, combined with the amount of weight you're pulling, combined with a mechanical disadvantage, to create enormous risk. And notice also that when you're doing a deadlift, it's always the palm that's facing forward that tears the bicep. It's never the palm that's facing back. Again, those 3 factors matter. Palm facing up, meaning the absence of assistance from the brachioradialis, elbow straight, meaning mechanical disadvantage, and a load that's greater than can be handled by that double magnification. So, so the question you want to ask yourself is very simply, do you want to gamble? Do you want to roll the dice? Do you want to try and tempt fate and see if you won't tear your bicep doing a preacher curl? And what is the benefit of taking that risk? There really is no additional benefit. You will not change the shape of your bicep by doing that. And, you know, there are some people that talk about this thing called stretch mediated loading. And stretch-mediated loading is essentially the same thing as early phase loading. So yes, there have been studies that have shown that if you load, and that's why we recommend early phase loading, right? The question is, how much can you early phase load before you tear the muscle? And keep in mind, we're only talking about flexion muscles here. Bicep, pectoral, hamstring, sometimes lat. These are the ones that reduce the angle of the joint rather than extending. The muscles that extend the joint have adapted to constant, always mechanical disadvantage. They never have a mechanical advantage. So that's why the tricep is striated, cross-hatched. Same with the quadricep, same with the quadricep because it's an extension muscle. And this is called pennate muscle.
Pennate muscle, yeah.
Pennate muscle.
We did a video about it.
Are cross-hatched. And so, and the reason they're cross-hatched is because they've adapted to the fact that they always have mechanical disadvantage, whereas the straight muscle fibers like the bicep are particularly vulnerable. Okay, so that's it for the preacher curl. And I think the next topic is what? Deadlifts?
Yeah, but before we move that, because, we want to make sure that we covered the physics part of it, some people will say, okay, if the exercise is slightly risky, like many other exercises, it's not the problem of the exercise that person got injured. It's that person who didn't know how to use it, and he used a lot of weight that he could have prevented. So my question is that true? And my second question will be, what is the benefit you will get from a light preacher curl?
Well, if you use a light preacher curl that provides the safety of full range of motion with mechanical disadvantage and not tear it, you will find that you're not going to get any, or at least significant, challenging resistance halfway to the range of motion and none at the end. So now, if you want to, let's say, do a study and say, what would happen if you do partial range of motion, preacher curl, versus full range of motion, upright curl, go ahead and do that study. My feeling is I would rather do full range of motion. I feel better doing full range of motion. And it's not either or. That's the thing that's important to understand. It's not either or. So let's just say that I'm going to do a standing cable curl, alternating cable curl. I might start standing slightly in front of those two pulleys, meaning those pulleys are slightly behind me, which means that when my forearms go straight down, there is a slight backward pull on my forearm. It's not straight vertical. It's not straight parallel to my forearm.
Right.
It is challenging my bicep a little bit more than it would if it was straight down, right? So I can do that, and I do that. And I do with a relatively light weight. I might do 30 reps, and then I increase the weight. As I increase the weight, and I encourage you to experiment with this, as you increase the weight, you will notice how that influences that early part of that range of motion. When you have too much, even slightly too much, opposing resistance at the beginning of the range of motion when you are in mechanical disadvantage. So what I do is, as the weight goes up, I start to step back and I start to diminish the resistance in the early phase and increase it in the late phase. And I will also, depending on how heavy I go. So if you want to go really heavy on curls, like say a 6 or a 4 rep curl, what I tell people and what I do myself, and I again, I encourage you to experiment with it, is I start pulling my elbow back slightly. I mean, some people even call that a drag curl. I actually pull my elbow back a little bit to create a bend in my elbow to gain a little mechanical advantage, right, bicep tendon to forearm, before I start bringing it forward and up, so that I can avoid that super high risk and still have a very, very heavy weight that allows me a full range of motion.
Mm-hmm. So it's not the fault of the exercise. It's the fault of the person.
It's physics. It's physics. I mean, it's, as I said, you can literally measure it. You can quantify it. Now, I joked last time is if anyone wants to bet me that they won't tear their bicep, please know that I was kidding. Yeah. Okay. Don't later say Doug told me to do this and I tore my bicep. But I will say that if you were to put your arm on a tabletop, and by the way, let me say that if you can put almost any weight in your hand when your forearm is vertical. You can put an 80-pound dumbbell in your hand and there's no risk, right? Because it's neutral. It's in the neutral position, right? So nothing is loaded either on one side or the other. If you were to then, with the palm up, if you were to lower that 60 or 80-pound dumbbell as strong as your bicep might be in a standing version of a curl, the odds of you tearing your bicep tendon like that are enormous. Right. Enormous. You can quantify it. You can do the math on it if you want, but I'm telling you, you are literally begging for a bicep rupture. Now, of course, a preacher curl is less severe than that, but the point is the same. It's all about mechanical disadvantage. It's all about physics. It's all about magnification, double magnification of load. It is not about form, and it is not about stretching the bicep.
Perfect. Well explained. All right, let's move on to the next topic.
He also says that the glute bridge / hip thrust is not that good. It does have issues, but just because something has a shorter range of motion and or you have to load it very heavily is not necessarily a bad thing. And the proof is in the pudding, or should I say in the cake. They work, and they work well. Just because you have to go heavy on a movement, it doesn't mean you're ego lifting. And not everyone who lifts heavy is doing it to impress other people or to fill some hole in their soul or anything like that. Sometimes you're just lifting heavy because you enjoy it or because it's what the movement actually requires. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Proof is in the mass on the asses of the masses.
Okay, so what am I doing here? If you walked into the gym and you saw me doing this exercise and you said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm working my triceps, you would think I was crazy, right? You would say, why are you complicating it so much? Why don't you just take a pulley and push straight down? And that's a good point. What I just did here is very much like a glute bridge. And a glute bridge is not a brilliant exercise, because let me explain. The fundamental premise of resistance exercise is to cause the muscle that you're targeting to be challenged, right? So if the tricep muscle extends the elbow, the weight has to bend the elbow, right? Well, you can bend the elbow by positively loading this end or negatively loading this end. I'm forcing the elbow to bend by doing this, or I'm forcing the elbow to bend by doing this, and the tricep has to work against that. And the glutes are the same way. When you're doing a glute bridge, you're negatively loading the femur instead of positively loading the other end of the femur, which would be much more simple and much more direct, much less complicated, because you're not involving that secondary lever, which is completely not necessary for loading that muscle. And you would be loading the muscle less, because by the time you put enough load here to give you the kind of load you would need by pushing straight, it would just be really, really uncomfortable. So the glute bridge is not a brilliant exercise. Just like this right here is not a brilliant tricep exercise.
All right.
Okay, so obviously I did that sort of tongue in cheek, but the point is made, right? Which is that those pipes that I use basically represent the lower legs in a glute bridge, right? And they're just a secondary lever. They're not necessary. You don't have to involve your lower leg. You don't have to involve your feet. And if you were to just load the end of the femur by, for example, a multi-hip machine. So here you can see a slide of me doing a multi-hip machine, and you can see not only that it's a much bigger range of motion than the glute bridge offers. Much, I mean, my leg, my thigh literally touches my chest at the top of the range of motion. It's over 110 degrees range of motion, which is significantly better than the 80 or 90 degree range of motion that was there. I'm using 210 pounds on this exercise with one leg. And I'm using it at the end of the femur, which means I'm getting full magnification. And on top of that, I'm not putting anything on my back. I'm not pushing it against the bench. I'm not putting it directly on my spine. So imagine I've got 210 pounds per leg. That's 420 pounds if I were to do both legs at the same time. But I'm avoiding bilateral deficit by doing one leg at a time. So when he says the glute bridge is not bad, I would say, well, depends what you call bad. All right. We don't think in terms of good and bad. We think in terms of better or worse. All right. What is the best way to work any muscle? Full range of motion, full lever length, full magnification, correct direction of resistance, avoiding bilateral deficit, avoiding reciprocal innervation, the 16 factors, the checklist that tell you what makes an exercise ideal. So you would take that checklist and you would look at the glute bridge and you would say, yes, no, no, yes, yes, no, 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 yes, no. So unless you get all yeses, it's not an ideal exercise. Is it a decent exercise? It's decent. It's decent, meaning that if you don't have a multi machine and you don't like or don't want to do, let's say, a backward lunge, it is one way of working the glutes. But to say that it's the best way of working the glutes when there's a multi-hip machine right over there, those of us that care about what works better and why it works better would say, well, I'm not going to waste my time with, this secondary lever and this convoluted reverse loading when it's so easy just to load the front end and then do it, in the comfort of not having anything on your back and one leg at a time.
Right. That checklist is the formula, right?
That's what you called it, the formula.
Yeah.
What is that, Dre?
It's the formula.
Look, there have to be principles, right? There's the principles of aviation, right? It's the same thing. It's like when you have a plane that weighs this much, you need a wingspan of this, you need a wing tilt of this, you need a wing thickness of this. This is all physics, right? So, the beauty of our program is it narrows down what is better than what. So you don't waste your time doing exercises that on a scale of 1 to 10 might rate a 6 or a 4, when if you knew what constitutes a 9 or a 10, you would rather do that.
Right.
He's also very, very much against deadlifting, and he said that while he usually does the Brig 20 exercises, occasionally he does some RDLs with 20 or 30-pound dumbbells.
So that's very heavy stuff. We know this, but...
And then he said something pretty shocking and honestly just kind of ridiculous. He said, I would never, ever load up a deadlift with 200 or 300 pounds.
But having said that, I would never do, a 200-pound or a 300-pound deadlift to get that feeling because I can get it with so much less.
And if he had said 500, 600, 700 pounds, I'd be like, yeah, fair enough. Or even 400 pounds, it's not really something that's necessary. But for me, 200 or 300 pounds is not some kind of ridiculous amount of weight. And if you can't deadlift 200 pounds as a grown-ass man, something is wrong. I'm not saying you have to do it every day or every week or even every month, but that is some basic survival shit. And Mark Bell's reaction was pretty much the exact same reaction that I had. It was something like this. All right, okay.
Get it with so much less.
And I really wish that he had followed up on this and been like, a 200-pound deadlift, really? Like, oh, we're not talking about world records here or anything like that.
All right.
Okay, so a lot of stuff here to unpack. Let me just start off by saying that when he said grown-ass man and when he said basic survival shit, he says everything he needs to say, which is that he's thinking like a caveman. Right? That's the bottom line. Is this is not survival. We're not talking the need to survive. No one needs to deadlift 400 pounds to survive. Right? Not to mention the fact that the strength gained from a 400-pound deadlift can also be gained other ways that don't include a deadlift. Okay, but the idea that you think you need to deadlift for survival, that's caveman thinking. Or the fact that you think that, that if you don't deadlift 400 pounds, you're not a grown-ass man. That what? You're a child, you're a boy, right? I mean, this is the kind of like superhero mentality that gets people in trouble. They're not thinking logically, and they're not thinking in a way that includes the physics that we're talking about here, which is basically a way to train smarter. So the first thing I want to show you is this one slide right here. And you can see here what I've done is I'm doing a deadlift on the left, and on the right, I'm doing a supine tricep extension. So what I'm showing you here is that extension is extension. Glute hip extension is very similar to elbow extension. All right. So they both have a pivot point. You can see that what I'm saying there is that my forearm simulates the torso, and I've drawn a straight line through the torso. So you can see that the similarity there. Okay. Now in this next slide, what I've done here is I've shown you that the torso is comprised of vertebrae, which are basically individual little bones, not a solid bone or two solid bones like the forearm is, right? So That means that you can load up that tricep extension and not worry about that forearm bending.
Right.
But because the spine is made up of vertebrae, the spine does bend, right? And you then rely on the erector spinae to keep it from happening. The problem is that the glute muscles, the hip extension muscles, are significantly more powerful than the erector spinae. So there's going to come a point when you cannot further load the gluteus without jeopardizing the spine, even though the gluteus can be further loaded. So in other words, you either have to underload the gluteus and protect the spine, or protect the spine and underload the gluteus, one or the other. So then, I don't know if I said that right. You can load the gluteus maximally and jeopardize the spine, or you can protect the spine and underload the gluteus. So on this next slide, what I'm showing you here on the left is the skeleton as it's bending at the hip. Now, I realize, of course, that there normally would be a little bit more knee bend than that, but the hip is doing that and the spine is doing that. And you can see the photo on the right is a guy who is, in fact, rounding his spine. Now, you might think this is fairly uncommon. I have dozens and dozens and dozens of pictures of lots of bodybuilders, advanced bodybuilders, rounding their spine like this. This is begging for a herniation. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if this person on the right already has a herniated disc and doesn't know it. Herniation happens because you have these, basically, let's call them square vertebrae. And as the spine bends forward, it brings the inner edges together and opens up the outer edges. And that gelatinous tissue, the intervertebral, this that's in between, gets squeezed on this side. And it's like toothpaste. It's like pushes it out the back. Now, sometimes it just bulges and sometimes it bursts and the gelatinous stuff comes out. And some people don't have back pain if they have a herniated disc. And some people do, because we have nerves that run right alongside our spine. And all it takes is a touch on one of those nerves and you have a lot of pain. You might even have some degree of numbness, depending on how long it's been there and how severe it is. And so what I'm getting at is this, is that the main reason to do a deadlift is to work that hip extension function, which is primarily the glutes with some assistance from the adductors and the hamstrings. So on this next slide, we're going back and you can see how straight I can keep my forearms because my forearms don't bend. And on the right, you can see that the back is actually rounding. And then when you get to the top on this next slide, you can see when you get to the top of the motion, all of your limbs are vertical, right? So you're not loading much, really. I mean, the barbell is slightly in front of you instead of behind you or alongside you. So there's still a little bit of a forward pull, but mostly it's just downward pull on your arms, which is your scapula, which is your spine. You can see there on that slide on the right that downward pull from the barbell, and this guy has what looks to be about, I don't know, maybe 600 pounds or close to 600, maybe 595. Anyway, and so that curving of the spine is going to compress like an accordion to some degree. How much? We don't know. But any amount of accordionish of the spine is not productive. You might avoid injury, but when you ask yourself, what's the gain? Why am I doing this? I'm doing this for primarily hip extension loading, isometric erector spinae loading, which we'll talk about in just a second. Isometric not being as good as dynamic loading, which is what's happening with the hip extension muscles. They're being dynamically loaded. So the question is, can you get that much, as much hip extension loading without jeopardizing the spine? And I just showed you that multi-hip machine, which is 210 pounds, one leg, right? So the answer is yes, you can get a shitload, of gluteus loading, of hip extension loading, without having to compress your spine, without jeopardizing your spine. Now, on this next slide, there I am doing the hip extension, 210 pounds, full range of motion. Look how that femur comes almost all the way up to my chest. So I'm getting just as much or more hip extension loading, glute loading, as I would without getting that jeopardizing of the spine. And on this next slide here, you can see on the left is the erector spinae. And what I'm doing there is dynamic torso extension. I'm actually moving my spine. Now I'm just demonstrating it just for the sake of form. You can then take a 20-pound dumbbell, a 30-pound dumbbell, whatever you want to take on there. If you haven't tried this exercise, I encourage you to try it without any weight first. Try doing 20 reps. Try doing full range of motion as I'm doing it there, where you're rounding the back and then arching the back, lifting the chest up, raising the shoulders. And you will be surprised how much erector spinae fatigue and loading you feel. And then you add a 10 or a 20 or a 30-pound weight to it, and it's significantly more. So this is going to give you significantly more erector spinae development than an isometric tension would. And in terms of survival, it's like, I have never found myself in a situation, despite the fact that I don't deadlift 400 pounds, never found myself in a situation where I'm sorry, I can't help you lift that couch. I helped a guy push his truck the other day because, you know, his car wouldn't start. I mean, you know, what kind of survival are we talking about here? Yeah. It is ridiculous to think that you need to deadlift, or to think that the muscles that would be involved in a deadlift can't be worked a better way.
So Doug, what's the purpose of you doing that look like a deadlift with dumbbells?
Oh, I also want to talk about that 20 or 30 pound thing that he criticized, the RDL.
Yeah.
What I'm doing is I'm basically loading the upper end of the torso lever, and then I'm rolling it, and I'm elongating the erector spinae and contracting the erector spinae the same way you would extend a bicep and contract a bicep or a tricep or a quadricep. Or, I mean, it's been studied, dynamic tension, dynamic muscle loading, full range of motion, or mostly full range of motion, is significantly more productive, both for strength increase and muscle size increase as compared to isometric. So if you think that doing isometric loading of the erector spinae is the best way to work the erector spinae, then you have to also believe that working everything else isometrically would be better or as good as dynamic, right? So then you would, or should, if that's what you believe, just hold a barbell at 90-degree bend there for your bicep training, and hold the tricep and hold the, and you know, you would not think to do isometric for any other body part. Why would you do it for the erector spinae? Right. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. Getting back to what he was saying, what I said is I take a pair of 20 or 30 pound dumbbells and I basically do the movement of hip extension for the sake of stretching. It's just a stretch in between sets. It's not meant to do what the gluteus machine, the hip extension machine, is doing with 210 pounds, which would be 420 pounds if I use both legs together. And you saw what I said to Mark was why would I use that exercise when I can get the same feeling a better way? Right. That's what I'm saying, right? So, you know, he's obviously speculating on what Mark Bell was thinking when I said that. Mark Bell understands far more than this person does. So he has the context that this person doesn't have. And so he's able to understand it, because we'd have conversations about this before. Now, this is not to say that Mark Bell doesn't enjoy deadlifting. Yeah, he does. And this is not to say that the whole ritual of being with your buddies and deadlifting isn't fun, but he does understand that if his objective is not to participate in the fun of that ritual, that if your objective was to get the maximum amount of gluteus loading or hip extension muscle loading and the most productive kind of erector spinae loading, you can do that doing the two exercises I just showed you and avoid entirely the spinal risk that happens when you compress and then you basically urge your torso to fold forward because you're trying to maximally load your, and by the way, you know, this ritual that I'm describing becomes competitive. Yeah. Right. And in the face of competition, that's when people get hurt. That's when people start doing things that are not quite careful because, you know, they kept their spine straight on that last set, but damn it, they want to go a little heavier. Yeah. And it's slightly exceeding. Now, boom. And it may not happen boom like that. It may happen, God, you know, a year later, it's like, my back's been bothering me. It's like, well,
you know, Doug, I understand that we all have different goals when we go to the gym. Like my primary goal is always go to have muscle growth. That's why I go to the gym. But sometimes I just go there because I need to be in the gym. I need to relax my mind. I need to, you know, focus on something else other than what I'm doing at home.
De-stress.
Exactly. right?
Yeah.
So at that point, I'm not in the gym trying to push as hard as I can and stuff. My goal is different, you know. So,
And by the way,
everyone-
when you load a muscle, it's going to get stronger.
yeah,
When I'm doing
Yeah.
a 210 pound hip extension on that multi hip machine, my glute is getting stronger. It's not just a cosmetic thing.
right. So what I'm saying is, like, it happens that sometimes I might use something different than what I usually use because my goal in that session is something else than muscle growth, you know. But it's important also to know that you cannot use those exercises if you want optimal muscle growth, you know, and that's what we're talking about here, efficiency. Use the most efficient exercises to get to that goal, you know, when the conditions are good.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, we're teaching how to get more. We're not teaching how to get less. You know, here's the thing is, I mean, you might get more using less, but you're still getting more load. The question is, are you avoiding the weak link in the chain in order to push the limit farther than that weak link would otherwise allow? Right. So, but the other thing I wanted to say too was, as we've said so many times, you know, I would not say don't do squats. I would not say don't do deadlifts.
Yeah.
What we're saying is that deadlifts have these mechanical issues. If you want to do a deadlift and you want to use perfectly good form and you want to use a couple 100 pounds and you're not inclined to let your spine fold forward, that's fine. But just keep in mind that your glutes are stronger, your hip extension muscle are stronger than your erector spinae. And there will come a point, if you continue pushing, when your glute strength will exceed your erector spinae strength and your form will suffer. And when your form suffers, you drastically increase the risk of injury. If you enjoy deadlifting 200, 300 pounds, assuming that's the limit for you before your spine starts to fold forward, that's perfectly okay. I'm not saying don't do that. I am saying there's a better way of loading the erector spinae and a better way of loading the glutes if your objective is to get the optimal loading.
Right.
The thing I disagree with him is rep ranges. I've had an article where he talked about doing sets of 50, 40, 30, 20, 15, 10. And that was his protocol. There's nothing wrong with not going heavier than 10, but using, 25-pound dumbbells for a decline press, honestly, that's not going to get you results if you're natural for the vast majority of people. I get that you don't want to talk about TRT or the enhanced side of things, but realize that if you're natural, in all likelihood, you will not look the same with this type of system.
All right.
Let me just tell you that I don't care how much TRT you're taking, you're never going to get big pecs with 25-pound dumbbells and a chest press. So if that's what he's suggesting, if he's thinking that I'm able to grow muscle or that someone is able to grow muscle using 50 rep sets or 40 or 30 rep sets because they're using steroids, that's like out in left field. I don't know where. I mean, obviously he's trying to find some justification for what he's trying to find fault in, but that's number one. Number two is there was an article that Steve Holman, I guess, co-authored with me. Steve Holman was the editor-in-chief of Ironman magazine. And he asked me if I was experimenting with any kind of training protocols. And so I said, well, lately I've been experimenting with 50, 40, 30, 20, 10 or 20, 15, 10. And that's sort of fun, especially if you have sort of a limited amount of time and you want to get a good pump, right? And it's not, he says, that's the protocol that Doug recommends. That is not the protocol that Doug recommends. Okay. He saw one thing as one of the things that I have experimented with, and thinks that is what I consider optimal, right? That is not what I consider optimal. That is not what I use to train for a bodybuilding competition. That is not what I want. That photo that he showed of me when I competed in the NABO World Championship, that's not the protocol I use there. That's not the protocol I use for winning the 2019 Mr. Universe. That is not the protocol I recommend. That is one way of experimenting. And the reason Steve Holman liked it was because at the time, Steve Holman was doing some research. So I was experimenting with that because I wanted to tease the muscle into getting more endurance, introducing fatigue to the muscle, right? And keep in mind that a 50 rep set would not be done to failure.
Yeah.
A 50 rep set would be done with a weight that allows you to do 70, but you're just getting that blood in there. Right. And then you add weight for the 40 rep set and you add weight for the 30 and every time you add weight, you get closer to a maximum percentage of effort. So the first set might be, 70% maximum effort. 80% on the next set, 85 on the next, 90 on the next, 95 on the next, 100 on the last, right? So it's not what he thinks it is. That's number one. What I really recommend is going as heavy as sets of 6 and 4. That's what I really recommend, but never starting with that heavy of a weight. But that takes, as I said, more sets to get there, right? So I might do a first set of 30 to warm it up. I might go to 20, 15, 10, 8, 6, 6, 6 is what I might do. But his characterization that's what I recommend is flat out false.
Yeah, he's simplifying many of the things, and he's also want to look that he looked in depth in what you're doing, and he's talking about it as if he really know what your principles are, or the 16 biomechanical factor, the formula.
What is that, Dre?
It's the formula.
That he don't know about.
Well, you know, if I heard that someone was recommending this protocol, I wouldn't automatically assume that that's the only protocol that guy is recommending.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, you know, I would want to talk to that person and say, you know, under what circumstances, for what candidate, for what goal, you know, would you use any other, you know, protocols for any other people with any other goals? The answer is most likely yes. I mean, the fact that he would find one thing that I said one time in the past and would think that's the only thing I recommend is ridiculous. And then he says, oh, I get that he doesn't want to talk about TRT. It's like, really, you get that? Yeah. Really, you think that's what I was doing? You think I was avoiding talking about that?
What makes him think that, in your opinion?
Well, this is the mind of a person who's looking for something to criticize. Mm-hmm. You know, look, as we've said in the past, there is not everyone has this mentality, but some people have a mentality to protect what they have believed and to therefore criticize what someone says that might be different than what they believe, because it sort of threatens their belief system, their identity, whatever. And so the impulse is to sort of criticize and attack instead of asking, am I understanding this correctly? Is there a particular candidate that you're recommending this for? Or it must be that you're recommending that because you're taking TRT. And so therefore, you know, it might work for you, but it's not going to work for that's out in left field. That's completely, I would never, ever, ever tell someone you can do high reps, low weight if you're not taking steroids. I would never say that. Or if you are taking steroids is what I mean. I would never say that. But if you're natural, I would never say that. Look, high reps does the same thing for someone who's not taking supplements as someone who is. Low reps does the same thing for someone who's not taking some as someone who is. High reps is high reps, low reps, low reps. I mean, everything gets more enhanced, of course, if you're juicing, but it's not one or the other. It's not like you can get away with this if you're not doing that or something that he's imagining.
Yeah, he didn't go in depth to do the videos. You know, he did the first video. That's why we responded. The second video I watched, it's basically trying to go deeper in what he said to justify his points. I don't think, honestly, that he understood the first video. And it's okay, because the goal in the beginning is the reason why we decided to do the video is because many people think the same way about those big lifts.
Right.
So this video is it's not only about him. It's about enlightening
the opportunity to
education.
teach.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it was obvious when we saw his first video that he didn't know anything about moment arm. He didn't know anything about physics, even though he's complimenting me on knowing physics. He doesn't understand moment arm. He doesn't understand mechanical advantage or disadvantage. Doesn't understand any of that stuff. And when we talked about it in our rebuttal video and he saw it, he had to have realized that he missed that. He had to have realized, oops, that's what I didn't get, right? And in fact, let me just show you something real quick here. Sure. But instead of saying, you know what, in other words, if he did a secondary video and said, you know what, I made a mistake. I didn't understand that concept of moment arm. I didn't understand that concept of mechanical advantage. And so therefore I apologize.
He said it's basic things.
Heaven forbid you apologize and acknowledge you're wrong. You've built your fan base on having everyone think that you know your subject. To admit that you don't know your subject is obviously self-destructive. So you're going to try to, you know, save face by pretending that, you know, Doug still doesn't get it and I do. But what I wanted to show you was he was saying in one of his, in his first video that during the squat, he says it's not the greatest exercise, but the knees are extending.
Right.
And so the quads are working. And so what I wanted to show you here was this idea of joint extension with either muscle load or less muscle load. In fact, let's see if I have a slide here I want to show you. Yeah. So here's a slide that I want to show you. It's a person, and it's three pictures. On the top, you see a guy doing a flat dumbbell press. And you can see that his forearms are vertical. Right now, presumably he's going to take that to the top, and he's going to bring his hands together. Right. So you can see that his elbows are going from bent to straight. You might then think that his triceps are extending his elbows. But in fact, his triceps are not necessarily extending his elbows. On that second picture there, you can see that I've had this person's forearms tip outward, away from that vertical neutral position. Rather than the triceps being involved, the biceps are involved because they're keeping that arm from falling farther that direction. If he did that exercise with that slight outward tilt of the forearm, the triceps would never be involved, not even a little bit. On the bottom picture, he's dipped his forearms inside that vertical line. Now he's loading his triceps. Now you can see in the middle picture, he's loading his biceps and also extending the length of his primary lever, which is his upper arm bone, the humerus, which is therefore further magnifying the weight that his pectoral is having to lift with that weight in his hand. In that bottom picture, he is diminishing the length of his upper arm bone by doubling over it. So he's engaging his triceps and shortening his humerus moment arm, therefore allowing him to lift a heavier weight or the same weight more easily. But the idea that a joint is extending that elbow, that a muscle is extending that elbow, is wrong unless you understand this moment arm concept. So imagine that this is you doing a rowing exercise. This is your upper arm bone. This is your forearm. Okay, so right now I'm holding this, and this force I'm going to apply on this bone is let's just call it the back muscles, the rear deltoid muscles, whatever muscles you believe are raising that arm up, and that elbow is bending. I'm not bending it by hanging on to either the origin or the insertion of the bicep or the tricep. It's bending passively.
Yeah.
Right? It's going along for the ride. It's attached to the upper end of the humerus, but it's acting like a string. Mm-hmm. It's acting just like a rope, holding that weight. Now, if I pull inward with my bicep as I'm rowing, I will activate my bicep a little bit. If I extend my elbow back a little bit, I will activate my tricep a little bit. But either way, it is not the bicep or the tricep that's causing that elbow to bend primarily. It is the rising elbow and the fact that the forearm hangs from the elbow. Same thing happens this way. If I'm pushing upward on a flat dumbbell press, I'm raising the upper end of my humerus and I'm lifting up the base of the forearm. Mm-hmm. And it only takes a little bit of bicep tricep coordination to keep that thing from falling one way or the other, or from falling this way rotationally, right? But primarily that rising elbow is what's causing that elbow to passively bend. So when you're looking at a squat and you're saying the knee is extending, so therefore the quad is working, it is working because of the moment arm that is created by the slight forward tilt of that lower leg. But it's not nearly as big of a moment arm, nor nearly as much loading as you would get with more of a perpendicular force acting on that lower leg.